All right, welcome everybody to the last lecture of the semester. Essentially, how do we know what we know? Here I have two images up here, one of discussing fake news and the other one essentially talking about dinosaurs and sort of how can we tell the difference between fake news and real news, and how do we know what we know? But before we dive into it, let's just do a quick review of things that we've learned from this semester. So far this semester, we've covered about 6 million years of human history. We've learned about anthropology, the study of humankind in all times and places. Learned about the four subfields, right? Physical anthropology, archaeology, linguistic anthropology, and cultural anthropology. We've learned about some of your basic methods in archaeology, things like the principle of superposition, as well as how to find a site and how to excavate a site. We learned about the world's first hominins, things like Australopithecus afarensis and Paranthropus boisei and Ardipithecus ramidus, and things like what makes us human. We learned about our ancestor Homo erectus and how the changes we see with Homo erectus radically changed essentially everything else, and how they left Africa and the development of fire. We learned about our close relatives, Homo neanderthalensis and Homo heidelbergensis, and how Homo neanderthalensis is somewhere inside of us. And we looked at the Middle Stone Age and the Upper Paleolithic and how we really see the advent of anatomically modern behavior during the Upper Paleolithic. We learned about the peopling of the Pacific and Australia, how you can get on some of these boats and go to some amazing locations. And then we learned about how people came to the New World. You learned about where your food comes from with the origins of agriculture, as well as the origins of social inequality in Mesopotamia and Sumeria. We learned about the world's earliest empires, the Akkadian Empire, Ur Empire, Ur and Ur III empires, as well as the origins of writing and how writing itself is a relatively recent event and how it was developed for different reasons. Then we got into the major civilizations of the world, right? We talked about the pyramids of Giza and the ancient Egyptians. We talked about mummies, Tutankhamun, Utsi, as well as the mummies of South America, the Indus civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, ancient China and the Shang city of Anyang. We learned about race, and really how race is tough because there's no biological foundation for it. We learned about how people would use racism to deny people their heritage in Africa. We learned about some of the great civilizations of Africa, such as Great Zimbabwe and Janae Jano. We learned about Canoic Man and Nagpra, and sort of how in the United States we've adapted our archaeological practices to accommodate and to essentially better respect and treat Native American remains. We learned about the local archaeology of Pennsylvania and how it can be just as amazing as the archaeology found in the rest of the world. We then continued west onto Cahokia and the mounds of North America. Made a turn south towards Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, entering what is modern-day Mexico, looking at the Olmec and the ancient city of Teotihuacan. You learned about the rise and the fall of the Maya, as well as the collapse and the development and the eventual collapse of the Aztec Empire. Here we see the ancient city of Tenochtitlan. We finally rounded out our trip by looking at the Moche and the Tiwanaku of South America, as well as Machu Picchu and the Inca state. And then in the last lecture, we learned about some of the things that are often used to talk about aliens and to other examples of essentially denying people their heritage through things like, aliens made the pyramids, or aliens made Stonehenge, or the Rapa Nui, or the Moai, or the Nazca lines, right? So this brings us to the question, how do we know what we know? Prior to 2016, most of this lecture was focused on really confronting things like ancient aliens. But now we've got to confront this issue called fake news and alternative facts. We live in an age in which knowledge is criticized, expertise is demonized. To know anything is to be viewed with skepticism, right? So how do we know what we know? And this essentially falls in the realm of what's called epistemology, the study of knowledge. And it's important to know that seeing is not necessarily believing, right? So here we have an image, the classic image of the Loch Ness monster in Loch Ness. But why do our brains love fake news? Why do our brains love things like ancient aliens?
Hey, hey, come here. Did you know that RuPaul claims that Trump touched him inappropriately in the 90s? Or that Obama signed an executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide? Okay, we all know that was some grade A, top shelf, premium fake news. But you knew that, right? You're way too smart and well informed to fall for that BS. But what if falling for fake news isn't about intelligence or how much information you have? What if we're hardwired to believe what we want to believe, regardless of the facts? The 2016 presidential election saw fake news come out of nowhere. A BuzzFeed analysis showed that the top 20 fake news articles on Facebook generated more clicks than the top 20 real articles from every major publication combined. They were shared millions of times. And it's not that we're just sharing fake news. We appear to be believing the stories too. A recent poll found that people believe fake news articles were somewhat or very accurate 75% of the time. How can we be falling for fake news when we have these things? We have instant access to more information than we've ever had before. Debunking misinformation should be a piece of cake, right? Decades of brain research say, no. Turns out, our brains have other plans. A little something called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is defined as a limitation in our thinking that can cause flaws in our judgment. It's kind of like an annoying brain glitch that can lead us to make faulty conclusions. Fake news often exploits this and our brains love it, even if we're not conscious of it happening. Once we form conclusions, they're hella hard to change, even if we're presented with facts or evidence that directly contradict those conclusions. So, what exactly is going on in our brains to make us think that fake news is real news? Why can't facts change our minds? There are many flavors of cognitive bias, but one of the most researched is confirmation bias. We seek out information that we believe or want to believe is true. It also leads us to ignore or minimize facts that threaten what we believe. So here's a study that explains how it works. Back in 2004, during the Kerry Bush election, researchers studied a group of 30 people, half Democrat, half Republican. Both candidates did what politicians do. They flip-flopped on the issues. Then the study asked the participants to analyze what the candidates said. The participants let the candidate in their own party off the hook, but were super critical of the candidate in the other party. When researchers looked at their brain scans, they found that the area of the brain responsible for reason, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, was inactive. So people weren't using reason when evaluating the candidates they liked, but they were using the part of the brain that processes emotion, the orbital frontal cortex, a classic case of confirmation bias. And their brains were also rewarding them with the rush of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good. So, is there any upside to confirmation bias? Well, it could help protect us from ideas that may threaten our social standing and our tribe. Dan Kahan, a law and psychology professor at Yale University, calls it identity protective cognition. We humans are hypersocial, so it's more important to protect our values in our relationships with family and friends than it is to risk losing that by adopting new beliefs. Are you familiar with Tomi Lahren? She's a conservative political commentator.
A protest is a peaceful objection to a grievance. A bunch of sore losers occupying a space is called a tantrum.
But recently, she expressed her pro-choice view on abortion.
No, I'm pro-choice, and here's why.
As a result, members of her conservative tribe turned on her. Ouch. So, how do we defeat confirmation bias? Well, you really can't, but our 3-step plan can help you get around it. Step 1 is recognize. Recognize that you have this bias in the first place. We all do. You made it this far in the video, so you can check that one off. Step 2 is consider. Consider that you may not really understand what you think you understand. Researchers call it the illusion of explanatory depth. Let's say I strongly believe that GMOs are bad for me. If someone forces me to explain it, I just might realize that I don't understand it as well as I thought I did. Now, I might be less confident in my belief and more receptive to another point of view. Step 3 is research. Research and break down the opposing viewpoint. You may realize that your understanding of where they're coming from is a bit too shallow. So now you know the perils of confirmation bias and have some tools to beat it. Let's try it out. Without being a smartass, pick a controversial topic and use step 3 on it. Don't try to persuade, but instead use research and facts to lay out why the other side believes what it believes. Put your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to good use, will you?
So confirmation bias is very much alive and well in how we interpret data, and this includes how we digest information related to archaeology and cultures. So here's a good example. The Weekly World News was a newspaper. Newspaper's a strong word. Supermarket tabloid that would have things like this: Central Eagles draft Godzilla, exchange student levels playing field most of town. They had some of my favorite stories. They were hilarious. Other ones like The Onion, right? So The Onion was and is sort of a piece of satire. They tell stories that seem plausibly true, but there's an element to them that you realize that isn't true. What about this one? This one makes it a little uncomfortable, right? So here we have Hillary Clinton, a political figure, and no matter what you feel about Hillary Clinton, I can promise you she has not adopted an alien baby, right? Nor is the Secret Service building a special nursery in the White House, as we see down here at the bottom. This has real world implications. So confirmation bias comes into play with something called Pizzagate. So in fall 2016, WikiLeaks released the Democratic Party emails, which were pretty instrumental in the election itself. But then individuals on 4chan and Reddit really dove into these WikiLeaks, and they started looking for words. So they thought coded pizza words, meant Comet Pizza. And so this idea was that pizza was essentially synonymous with pedophilia. So they were arguing that let's go out for a slice of pizza meant that we were going to go out and molest some children. That's what this idea was. And so people are always talking about going to get pizza in D.C. And that the headquarters for this was in fact at a place called Comet Pizza. And so this theory took off in Twitter, conservative fake news websites. Even the Turkish government was involved, and European Twitter bots were involved in promoting this idea. And it really just it got into this like InfoWars, which is just, there's not an ounce of truth in InfoWars. And if you try to sort of flowchart out the whole thing, this story, it just takes on a life of its own. But there are real world consequences to this. So the thing about the confirmation bias is that there's this, within this particular community, this presumption that the Clintons and the Democratic Party, in fact, is inherently evil and they do terrible things. So of course they must have a child sex ring, right? So in the Sunday, December 4th of 2016, 28-year-old fella from Salisbury, North Carolina, by the name of Edgar Welsh, decides he's going to investigate Comet Pizza, and he barges into Comet Pizza with an assault rifle, looking for this child sex ring run by Hillary Clinton. And in fact, right, that it's not. It's just a pizza shop. He even he held up a gun to them and said, open the storage closet. That's where the children are. And of course, they open the storage closet, and there's nothing in there but pizza boxes, right? So there are very real world consequences when these are taken into the hands of individuals who may not necessarily think things through, but are acting more on emotion rather than logic. This is a pretty good example of confirmation bias, in which you have a story and people are seeing what they want to see rather than going, oh, maybe this isn't true. So how do we process our information? Well, one, we collect information directly through our own experiences. I saw this. I saw Bigfoot. I swear I saw Bigfoot. We also collect information indirectly. So our friends will tell us a story. Our parents will tell us a story. Our social media will tell us a story, right? That's where the confirmation bias comes in. We see a story that comes across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, you name it, and we tend to believe it, but we didn't actually see it. Problem is that people are notoriously poor observers, and if you take psychology classes, they'll tell you all about this, right? We try to force things that we see into our boxes in our brain that help us interpret the data. So records of mythical creatures, dragons, unicorns, mermaids, things like that, are illustrations of this. These are things that we think we see. All right, so here we have the New Hampshire, the old man on the mountain. So when you look at this, this is essentially just a rock outcrop that unfortunately is no longer there, but in its profile, it looks like an old man. Here's his nose, here's his beard, here's his eyebrows, his eyes are in here. On Mars, right, we have the world's largest smiley face, right? So here's the eyes, here's the mouth, here's his head. We also have Kermit the Frog, right? So here you can see his face, his hands is up here, here's his body, right? So the human eye tries to make sense of what we see. Many of you probably remember this controversy.
Alright, so the world has seemingly become utterly divided on this dress. What colors do you see? On the one hand, we have team black and blue. On the other, team white and gold. We asked on Twitter and got hundreds of responses for both white and gold and black and blue. For what it's worth, we both saw black and blue and thought this was a massive prank at first. So how can it be possible for people to see it so differently? It's a phenomenon known as color constancy. Take this cube, for example. The middle square on the top appears to be a shade of brown, while the one on the side looks much more orange. But in actuality, they're both the exact same color. We promise we haven't cheated here or done any trick photography. Instead, our brain looks at the context, sees a shadow, and instantly thinks, oh, shadows make objects appear darker. And so the brain compensates and interprets the square as lighter than it appears, until the shadow is taken away. Back to the dress, and we have a similar situation, except here the context is very arbitrary. We're so close up to the dress that we don't really know its surroundings, and the brain has to make assumptions. People who picture the dress as white have brains which may be interpreting the dress in a blue lit room, for example, as in it's near a window with a bright blue sky. It makes perfect sense then that the white dress would be tinted blue and that the gold color wouldn't really change. On the other hand, the brains of people who see it as black and blue may be interpreting the dress in an artificially lit setting like somewhere with yellow lights. As a result, the brain sees the gold as just a reflection off of the black and believes that the blue has been unaffected. Chances are that this image just happens to be perfectly ambiguous to our brain, meaning it all comes down to individual perception and even how and where you view the image. From a factual standpoint, the dress is blue. In fact, here are some other pictures of it. But this is a beautiful example of how our brains have evolved to interpret the world around us without us even realizing. Want more answers to the world's craziest phenomena? Get the ASAP Science...
Right. For the record, I saw it as black and blue. But so you get the idea, right? So our eyes cannot necessarily always be trusted.
Alright.
So how do we know what we know? Well, there is a real and knowable universe. And the universe operates according to understandable laws. And that these laws are immutable and that they can largely be understood. There's something called Occam's razor. So William of Occam was a 14th century English philosopher, and he argued that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. Essentially, when you have two competing theories, the one that is simpler is the one that is better. And so enter in one of my favorite villains, Erich von Däniken. So Erich von Däniken was a Swiss writer. He wrote a very popular book called Chariots of the Gods. He claims that ancient civilizations were influenced by extraterrestrial visits. So this is the basis of the Ancient Aliens series. He argues that aliens or that the ancients would not have been able to recognize the aliens, so that the aliens were in fact sort of, they look like everybody else. This book was so popular that they in fact made an amusement park out of it, mystery park. And so we're scientists, right? So we are going to use the scientific process, and we have a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that ancient aliens came down. So we're going to test this hypothesis by looking for proof of ancient aliens. Van Däniken's proof, right? So he thought these were aliens. He thought this Maya skull with its sort of elongated shape is in fact an alien, and that this was essentially something, the brains were sucked out of the aliens. But in fact, what this is cranial modification. So what a practice in Mesoamerica and other parts of the world, like in Mesopotamia, when a baby is born, the baby's head's really squishy, right? The babies have the soft spot because their skull, one, has to be able to squeeze out through the birth canal, And two, the brain is going to grow really, really quickly, so the plates in your skull are not fused together. So what this actually allows you to do, some societies have discovered, is that you can actually take the baby's skull and wrap a band around it, or wrap a board around it, and you can actually shape the skull such that it actually makes this elongated shape. In the ancient Maya world, a skull like this was a sign of aristocracy, was a sign of wealth, was a sign of prestige. Van Daniken thought that this was an alien. This is in fact I believe this is associated with syphilis. So the skull is essentially eaten away at it. I actually encountered craniomodification in my dissertation work in Syria. So at our site, Tel Zaydan, which is associated with the Ubaid period, which is the period that you learned about, where we get the emergence of social complexity. During the Ubaid period, we find them doing a similar thing. So this is an infant's skull, and it looks like a bean. So what happens is that when an infant is born in the Ubaid period, they would in fact wrap a band around it to try to get this desired elongated shape. This was not in fact an alien. This was a human. This is a baby. And of course, then this is propagated by right. This idea is ancient aliens. Right. I don't know. Therefore, aliens. I wasn't saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. Aliens. Right. Rubber duckies. Aliens. And of course, a terrible movie that nobody should ever watch, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. You broke my heart. We get the Nazca lines, right? So Van Daniken was saying that in North Africa we have these drawings in the deserts, that this looks like an alien, or this looks like an astronaut. In France we have a cave painting, here's another astronaut. In Australia, Aborigines, this also looks like an astronaut. The Nazca geoglyphs can only be seen from space, right? These were left behind by aliens. This dude, as I mentioned before, also an alien, right? Here's his helmet right here. Lord Pakal, as I mentioned, Lord Pakal from Palenque, the one who essentially, his tomb had the Maya underworld and the Maya iconography on it. The glyphs on his tomb inform us about death and the beliefs in the afterlife. However, Van Daniken thought it was in fact a spaceship. You're like, well, why did he think that? Well, so here it is laid out like this. But really, to think of it as a spaceship, you have to look at it on its side like this, and you have to see him, Lord Pakal, essentially as sitting in a seat right here, and that his hands are essentially on little controls, and then essentially he's blasting off, right? So if we were to apply Occam's razor to Van Daniken's theory, right, there are a couple caveats, right? So one is that space people have to exist. They have to travel through the interstellar space, and space is so mind-numbingly big that if you really want to scare yourself, read into it, and then I promise you will probably end up huddled in a corner just how big space truly is. So people would have to have traveled, or these aliens have to have traveled through interstellar space, that they did travel. They used liquid propellants, because that's what we're seeing. That's what he argues. He also argues that they used 1960s style spacesuits, right? So these are 1960s style spacesuits. That the ancient people saw them, that the ancient people drew them not knowing what they were, right? Archaeologist theory, right, that people in antiquity are capable of creating artifacts that are relevant to their culture, and in fact, right, they did, right? So which of these two is more simple? Which of these two is simpler, right? People are able to create things. We're smarter than we give ourselves credit for. And so the downside of this is that Van Daniken views ancient cultures as ignorant and primitive. Ancient cultures are not ignorant and primitive. They are amazingly smart. If you ever try to go and make a stone tool, try it sometime. See how well you do. People are super, super smart, and ancient cultures are super smart. You also have to consider the evidence in its entirety and can't pick and choose data that best fits your argument. You need to consider the context of the find. And that based off of all this, there's actually little evidence to support his hypothesis that aliens came down. So as I mentioned ancient aliens, I mentioned Van Daniken. We also have another guy who comes out. So America Before. So in this case, we have Graham Hancock, and he publishes this book called America Before, The Key to Earth's Lost Civilization. This was a New York Times bestseller. He was interviewed on the Joe Rogan Experience. And what does he do is he misinterprets archaeological data and interpretation. So in this case, he's not necessarily saying that aliens did it, but he does promote this idea that Native Americans, once again, could not have done what they did in the Americas. So the back of the book says, quote, astonishing similarities exist between the spiritual beliefs of ancient Egyptians as manifested in the books of the dead and the spiritual beliefs of the mound builder cultures of the Mississippi Valley, as manifested, for example, at Moundville in Alabama, Cahokia in Illinois, and Watson Brake in Louisiana. Hitherto written off as coincidental, he puts in quotes, by archaeologists, this new investigation presented in America before confirms that the parallels are very real. The deep and explicit details, imagery, and beliefs shared by these two supposedly unconnected religious systems can no longer be dismissed as coincidence, nor are they the result of direct diffusion of culture from ancient Egypt to ancient North America or vice versa. Challenging our entire understanding of prehistory, what the evidence points to is instead a shared legacy of sophisticated ideas concerning the mystery of life and death inherited more than 13,000 years ago in both the Old and New from an advanced predecessor civilization as yet unidentified by archaeologists. Right. So his general claims is that in the late Pleistocene, there existed a civilization equal to that of the 19th century Europe. And that there was a comet, that this comet destroyed the Clovis culture, and that this was the resultant of explains the mounds of North America. He once again links, well, even though he says that he does not specifically link, he definitely goes back and then does it. It links Northern Europe, Egypt, and the Pacific with the pyramids of Giza. He also says that these ancient people had the additional benefit of psychic abilities, including telepathy, telekinesis, remote viewing, and magical healing powers, and that archaeologists are intentionally hiding the truth. I can promise you, I am not hiding the truth. There is no ancient civilization that has 19th century stuff. If we found that to be true, we would publish about it. It would be truly remarkable, but we don't. So when you're weighing the truth about things, right, think about how was the data obtained, right? What are the motives of this article? What's the person's expertise? Have they spent their entire life devoted to studying a field? Or did they just happen to watch a YouTube video and now they're an expert on it? Is the information peer-reviewed? And what I mean by that is when something is published, is it sent out to other experts in the field to evaluate the quality and the credibility of that research? So, for example, here in the publication of the journal Science, Science is the premier journal in the world in which information and an article is peer-reviewed. It's sent out to other experts, and they can more or less help judge whether or not this article has value, as opposed to National Enquirer, which is just essentially entertaining, but it's not news. Scientist captures 200-pound man-eating sea urchin. You're next, Eric Rudolph. Right? So this is how you weigh the truth. And so things to remember when studying the past and living in the present, right? So Ruth Benedict had this great saying, we do not see the lens through which we look. We don't see the factors and influence that influence our perspectives. Think about cognitive bias, in particular confirmation bias, right? So in Great Zimbabwe, the people who were looking at Great Zimbabwe were sure that they had found evidence for a white civilization because they were looking for an evidence of a lost white civilization. They had confirmation bias, right? They wanted to find evidence for a lost white civilization, and lo and behold, they did. Also think of Occam's razor, right? We do not... The simplest explanation is probably the best explanation. And so these are some things to take away when you take away from this course when you're looking at stories about the past, and when you hear newspaper articles or see things shared on social media. And that hopefully now when you come across these stories, particularly involving history, you'll have a better sense about it, as well as being able to place it within the context of the different civilizations that we've studied.